What's wrong? Oh, I crushed the dead fly. No respect for the fly corpse on the floor. I must have stepped right on him. So I say namaste to you, and it's a bad day for Mr. Fly. Well, today's Pentecost. And I used to get in all kinds of arguments with priests about Pentecost. I used to get in all kinds of arguments with priests, period. And I guess we could say some of them were about Pentecost. And whether Pentecost was the most important day in the Christian year. And I always said no, because if you don't have Christmas, none of the rest of it happens. This was not an acceptable argument, but I'm still maintaining, if you don't have Christmas, none of the rest of it happened. But it's kind of strange, because it occurred to me that you can look at Pentecost as something that kind of comes from outside and gets splashed on you, like standing next to a pool while somebody does a cannonball or something. Or you can look at it as something that comes from within you. And I think through most of history, people have tried to say, at least in the West, that spiritual history, or spiritual practice rather, comes on us from outside. And the Christian language in particular is filled with that kind of stuff. They talk about Pentecost, they say, oh, the Spirit fell. Does it have bad balance? I mean, but it fell. And there's actually, in the Bible, a couple different descriptions of Pentecost. This is the short version of one. This is the one that if you don't like somebody who comes to your thing, whether it's church or a group like this, you do the full reading and make them read it. Because it's got all these obscure names. Parthians and Medes, and there's like 12 obscure names that nobody can say, and you give that to them. If they're full of themselves, you let them read all that, and it brings them right down to earth. What's that?
I think you made me read it.
Well, yeah, but that was because I didn't like you. But, so in this one, you have Easter, and you have the resurrection, and some time goes by, and you come to Jesus' magic carpet ride that we talked about last week, and the ascension, and he just goes up into heaven, and then some point later, the disciples are all gathered somewhere with a whole bunch of other people. We're not really sure how many, but people from all over the known world at that time. And here comes the Holy Spirit. It falls on them. They have little fire on their heads, but you'd think it would, kind of mess with the hair, but apparently it didn't. And now, it wasn't that they were talking funny languages, it was that this was kind of like a universal translator. And so now everybody could speak their language, and everybody understood them, whether they spoke that language or not. Now, wheel this thing into reverse a little bit. Jesus gets crucified, he's resurrected, it's the next day or the day later, the disciples are all in the upper room in Jerusalem, and Jesus shows up, he comes through the wall, not through the door, he says, receive the Holy Spirit, he blows on them. Now they have the Holy Spirit. He also says something interesting about, and this is one of the other readings for today, if possible. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain them, they are retained. And it goes on. So now, sometime apparently between whenever that happened and when this happens, which is probably a couple of years, the disciples, apparently the apostles forgot about the whole thing in the upper room, and now they meet it again, and the fire goes on. If you read it like it's a newspaper. On the other hand, you can look at Pentecost as a symbol of understanding. Pardon me. And it's a symbol of understanding, and you can say this about the Holy Spirit too, that transcends all of our human-made divisions. And so, you might be from this country and speak this language, you might be from over here, I might be from up here, somebody else is from down here, and yet, if we choose to, we can all get along. Now, you get back to the late 1800s, and actually the very early 1900s, and something totally different happens in America, where there's these people out in Los Angeles, and they start having these experiences of the Holy Spirit where they start speaking in tongues. Only, well, actually, while they would say that they're just literally following what happens in the Bible, they're saying weird stuff like blah, 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 and everybody else says, oh, that means this. So it isn't sort of this universal translator, now it's this special experience you have to have. And, you know, some of you people, you're Christians and you've been baptized and stuff, but if you don't have this second baptism, you're not quite up to snuff. And all of a sudden, surprise of surprise, if you want to be part of this group, you're having this experience. And it was, sometimes you had this experience because you were locked in these old rundown buildings that they were using for churches in rundown areas of Los Angeles, and it was summertime and it was hot, and they didn't feed you, and you were in this room having these services, and the windows weren't open, and if that didn't happen to you during the service, well then you could go upstairs and pray where the windows weren't open, and it was even hotter because heat rises, and pretty soon, you know, they were passing out, and they said, oh geez, that must be the Spirit, rather than 105 degrees. And so there got to be all this division around this thing that was originally supposed to be about all of this unity. So, I have a couple stories around this one. I don't really know how relevant it is, but it's kind of funny. It's about Ram Dass. And he tells a story about before his stroke, but after he'd come to live in Hawaii, he was doing a lot of speaking engagements, and this group on one of the other Hawaiian islands wanted him to come, and they said they were an invitation group. And they wanted him to speak. So when you're one of those celebrity speakers, you kind of just, somebody gives you a piece of paper, says get on this plane, and you land there and you don't really know necessarily who you're going to talk to. And they let him into this room, and this leader of this group was here, and the group leader starts going, blah, 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 blah. And Ram Dass pretty soon figured out they must be making up their own language, and so he started answering in gibberish, and pretty soon this curtain fell away and all the people were there watching, and it descended into this bizarre thing. Do you know what primal scream therapy? It was this idea that if you scream, just scream to the top of your lungs, you have some kind of psychological breakthrough, or get a sore throat. There was no guarantee which one was going to happen. And so he finally has this bizarre primal scream experience. And I mention the story because we imagine that there's all these sort of, at very least, extraordinary things we have to do, or very special things, or very much things you wouldn't do normally, or if you're a little more cynical like me, very strange, bizarre sort of stuff. And then you'll be spiritually awakened. And yet, in our first reading, Ram Dass was talking about this whole idea that it's within. So I did this wedding yesterday, and I'll never be a florist. That's okay. But they had the coolest runner because it was outdoors, and they had one of those wedding arches, and then instead of wrapping that gauzy tulle stuff around the arch, they're very much into the outdoors, so they had it wasn't really quite burlap, I'm sure it was a kind of canvas. And they put that over the arch and gathered it with some, I think it was some rope actually, and then they had the runner down the aisle, and instead of it being a white runner, it was a piece of that same canvas material, and then on the edges they had stitched like some pretty sturdy lace that was about this wide down both edges. So it was really kind of cool, rustic, outdoorsy, and yet not overly masculine kind of runner thing. There was a little girl in the wedding who had a little, sort of like a laurel wreath thing that matched the motif. She was one of the flower girls, and probably about 7 or 8 years old. She had glasses, and I relate to little kids with glasses because I wasn't that young when I had my first glasses, but I was like one of the first kids to get glasses, and she was really cute. And so she was moving around, and it was just funny to watch the wedding through like a little girl's perspective like that, because the bride's name is Amy, and I heard her, she was walking by me and she was saying to herself, oh, now I'm going to have to introduce everyone to Amy. It's just the wedding wasn't about that, right? And she comes up to me at the reception. We were sitting eating dinner, and she said, "I remember you." And I said, "Well, I remember you too. You did a really nice job, you know." And she said, "You're the one with all the words." From the mouths of babes, right? I just got done telling somebody, my wife frequently tells me I'm full of shit, and this gets said a little more gracefully. And at some point her father came up to me, and he was, there were two best men, the two brothers of the groom were co-best men, and the older one came up. He's the father of this little girl, and his wife happened to be from India, and he had noticed my own tattoo at the rehearsal on my arm, and he started asking me, you know, what that was about, and his family was Roman Catholic, and, but he said that when he first met his wife, and considered the teaching he had received as a kid that said that, you know, here's somebody who's not a Christian, so they're going to hell. He really struggled with that for a long time, and finally came to the conclusion that that didn't make any sense, and not just because his wife is Indian, but that there's a lot of problems with the idea of a God who would say, well, just because of, you know, the accident of where you were born, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to roast you like a hot dog for all eternity. And so we talked a little bit about that, and it turned out that the fact that I have this where people can see it, and some of the more traditional Christian symbols are a little covered, actually had been an opening, and I would say it was an opening of the Spirit, and that there's a couple of ways to look at this kind of thing. Now, obviously, this is outside him, it's on top of me, but it's outside him. So you can say, well, did that come from outside him, or is it that we see things that either remind us of something, or remind us of someone, or spark some kind of a memory about something, and it starts those spiritual gears turning. And now this becomes an opportunity for dialogue. And yet, there's other symbols and signs that we look at and we just go, oh man, you know, I don't want anything to do with that. If you know, I talk about spiritual food poisoning. If you've ever had food poisoning at a restaurant, driving by the restaurant and seeing the sign is enough to kind of make your stomach go, oh. And you're not likely to go back there for a long time. Some people have spiritual food poisoning. They've been to a certain kind of spiritual institution, it just turned them off. If they drive by one and see the signs, see the symbols, whatever it is, it just turns them off. So I think there are things that we see that trigger memories within us that can be either opening or closing. So what are the closing memories? Well, they're usually memories where somebody said, you're not okay. And it's usually that you're not okay in a real fundamental, foundational way. So it's not like you could go home and change your shirt and now you'd be okay. It's something about your essence. And particularly when we start talking about Pentecost, and we go back to this place where there was this really diverse group of people, and time, where there's this really diverse group of people, and the message was, everybody's okay. Everybody's invited. And there wasn't any, as long as, you know, everybody's invited as long as, this, and the other. It was just, you're invited, and not only that, we're going to do our best to make sure you understand what's happening, and make you feel welcome here, and so that nobody's getting this message that says, oh, you're from over there? You know, it's sort of I saw some pictures this morning on Facebook. They talked about trying to unsee somebody. You know, where you look and you see somebody coming in the room and it's somebody you don't want to talk to, so you try quick to look away like you can see. Where there isn't any of that in the spiritual context, where you see and you see it all, and it's okay. And there's a big part of me that thinks most of us raised in the West need that little nudge of affirmation from the outside in order to free up what's inside and allow us to really discover that we're, in fact, quite spiritually okay, quite okay in every sense. And that these lines we draw, and we make these little clubs. We're in the Catholic club, you're in the Lutheran club, you're in the Methodist club. Oh, nobody not from our club can come in here. That's all really this kind of twisted attempt to say, I'm okay because you're less okay than me. And as long as there's somebody less okay than me, at least I'm not on the bottom of the barrel. And I think that authentic spirituality for those of us in the West starts when we internally start to consider that maybe all those messages are wrong. That maybe, in fact, there's nothing about anything worthy of calling a God that would do that kind of separating. And that instead, rather than do what we do instinctively, which is look for what's different, because that's how you survive, right? You're caveman or you're cave woman, you're running along, here comes a wolf, the wolf looks different than the rest of your family, so you run and hide, you don't get attacked by the wolf. That's a pretty good thing. But it's been a long time since those days. And we need to transcend those messages. And I think if we're going to take Pentecost and make it meaningful in 2014 and forward, we need to stop making it about being able to babble and be understood. Send me $1,000, I'll sweat on a towel and send it back to you while I pray in tongues over it. We need to make it instead about transcending those barriers. Because to me, that's what this original thing was. It wasn't about building barriers, it was about transcending them. And one last thought about this whole upper room thing where Jesus comes in through the wall, says to the apostles, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive any sins, they are forgiven. If you retain them, they are retained. And the church took it and said, great, priests can forgive sins. And if they won't forgive your sin, you're screwed because you're going to carry it through all eternity. So, really? So if I have a disagreement with somebody, my mother's a great example of this. She doesn't watch my stuff, so I can talk about it. But I would have told her this to her face. My parents separated in 1978. Sometime in the 2000s, she said to me, and she'd said it many times in between, I don't know how your father looks at himself in the mirror in the morning when he shaves after divorcing me. And I finally had to say, he does it just fine, I'm sure, because he doesn't think about you. Because it's been, I think at that point it had been like close to 30 years. It's been 30 years. And your unwillingness to forgive him isn't something that's pinning anything on him, it's pinning it on you. And so Jesus said, if you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. If you retain them, they're retained. But I think what got left off was by you. And that's relevant to Pentecost too, because we use that refusal to forgive as a justification for being part. Now, we're never going to love everybody, we're never going to want to go out to dinner with everybody. That's not really what loving them means. There's always going to be some people who probably rub us the wrong way. But can we be kind? Can we let go of that enough to say, they can have dinner wherever they're going to have dinner, and I can hope they enjoy it, even as I admit I'll probably enjoy it better without them here. and that's okay because we're all different. But different doesn't have to mean permanently apart. Different doesn't have to mean wishing somebody ill. Different certainly doesn't have to mean trying to convince them that God hates them because they're different. Different doesn't have to mean I'm willing to go to war to make you like me. And you can take it either way. Make you like me as in you think I'm pretty neat, or make you like me as in you behave like me, but probably what we really want to do is make everybody the same, like us. And I think the value of Pentecost is that it comes to say, no, that's not it. It's about coming together. And if we really could do that, maybe I'd be willing to admit it was the most important day of the church year.